All right, today we're jumping into a really provocative take on the Trump administration's strategy with Iran. This comes from an interview with Dr. Sheila Nazarian, and she doesn't mince words. She calls the whole diplomatic effort a sham show. So, what exactly does she mean? Let's break it down.
So, this really brings us to the big question right at the heart of her argument. Why on earth would a president go through the motions of diplomacy if he thinks it's just going to fail anyway? It seems like a total contradiction, right? But according to Dr. Nazarian's analysis, there's actually a very specific and very calculated logic behind it.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for unpacking all this. We're going to look at 5 key pieces of her argument. First up, what she calls Trump's good try diplomacy. Then we'll get into her view of Iran as an evil force. After that, we'll cover her critique of the West, this idea of fighting with tied hands. Then we'll move to her diagnosis of Islam, and we'll wrap it all up with her call for clarity. All right, let's kick things off with that first point. Trump's good try diplomacy. According to this source, this wasn't really a genuine push for peace. Nope, it was more like, well, a calculated performance put on for the whole world to see. And this quote really nails the core of her argument. The idea is that the peace talks were all about optics. It was basically a required public performance, a way to show the world, hey, look, we tried everything peaceful we could before moving on to something much more decisive. So what was the end game here? Well, according to the source, this sham show of diplomacy was the key to justifying the real goal, taking control of the Strait of Hormuz. And why is that so important? Because she calls it the Iranian regime's sole point of leverage. Think about it. It's an absolutely critical choke point for the entire global economy, especially oil. Okay, so that brings us to our next section. This is where the argument really lays out why such a hardline strategy was seen as necessary to begin with. And the title here says it all, an evil force. To back up this stance, the source points a finger directly at Iran for a whole laundry list of problems in the Middle East. We're talking about backing Hezbollah, funding Shia militias in Iraq, supporting Hamas, aiding the Houthis, propping up Assad in Syria. The bottom line of this argument is that Iran is basically the #1 destabilizing force in the entire region. And it's not just about what's happening in other countries. The source also points to a staggering human cost inside Iran itself. It highlights this claim that the regime has killed 40,000 of its own people, innocent civilians. That number is really used to drive home the point about the government's brutality. You can see the language used here is incredibly direct. There's no ambiguity at all. The regime is described as a murderous dictatorship and a destabilizing, dangerous, evil force. And this really strong condemnation is put forward as the main justification for taking such an aggressive stance against them. Okay, so now that we have that context, the argument takes a turn. Section 3 is a really sharp critique of how the West is responding to this threat, and the source has a name for it: fighting with tied hands. And this slide lays out a really stark contrast. You've got the Western approach on one side, which is framed as being all about self-restraint, worried about being called Islamophobic. The source basically says this is like fighting with your hand tied behind your back. And then you have the regime's approach. They don't care about being called names. They just fight aggressively, or to use the source's colorful phrase, they fight with a razor in our mouth. The key takeaway here is that this perceived weakness in the West becomes a huge strategic disadvantage. And to really drive this point home about Western discourse, the source uses a highly provocative analogy. She directly compares the keffiyeh, which you see on some U.S. college campuses, to a KKK hood. This is her way of framing some pro-Hamas sentiment as being aligned with what she sees as a hateful ideology. So all of this brings us to Section 4, and this gets into what is probably the most sensitive and controversial part of her argument. She calls it a diagnosis of Islam, and it's presented as her analysis of where this conflict's ideological roots really lie. Now, Dr. Nazarian frames this analysis through her own personal story. She lays out this path to how she came to her understanding. First, she and her family fled Iran under gunfire after the Islamic Revolution. Then she decided to take classes on Islam specifically to understand why that happened. And what she says she concluded is that the Quran itself has violent passages that come later in the text, and that these are considered more important, essentially overriding the earlier, more peaceful verses. And that leads her to this really stark conclusion, which we're showing you verbatim from her interview. If someone is a devout Muslim and follows everything it says in the Quran, they are going to be violent. So that's the central claim of her diagnosis. She's directly linking violence to what she sees as a literalist interpretation of the holy text. So how does she connect this back to her critique of the West? Well, she sort of redefines the term Islamophobia. She argues that it's not really about bigotry, but that it's used as a tool for censorship. She says it's like cutting the vocal cords of anybody who wants to ask a question. Her point is that this word is what stops people from making the very diagnosis she thinks is so essential. So if that's the diagnosis, what's the solution? Well, she proposes an internal reformation. The source calls for an evolution inside Islam itself. She even draws a parallel to the Christian Crusades, suggesting that a really difficult period of change is needed to make the religion, and these are her words, compatible with the rest of the world. And that brings us to our final section, a call for clarity. This is where she ties all these different threads together and circles right back to the Trump administration's political actions. And here's where her approval of that administration's approach becomes really explicit. She doesn't just see their hardline actions as pragmatic, she frames them as proof of moral clarity, character, and the fortitude to take action. And she suggests those are qualities that were pretty much missing from previous administrations. So we're left with a really crucial question to think about. When a conflict is framed the way the source does here, as a struggle against a death cult, where exactly is the line between having moral clarity and just dangerous escalation? That's the real tension at the heart of this entire argument, and it definitely leaves us with a lot to chew on.